Shalom, everybody. This is David Mark from Eretz Israel, speaking with Daniel Lori, the Executive Director of Yemenite Kohanim, for our third episode of Jerusalem Hot Topics. It's been a momentous few days here. The courts in Israel have ruled once again in favor of the Hektish, the sanctified trust, which Yemenite Kohanim works with in the Yemenite Village. And the Arabs after Shabbat had basically, for all intents and purposes, thrown a tantrum again, and threw a mouth of cocktails and rocks and threw their violence. Why? Not because anybody was being removed that night, but because of the ruling of the courts and the court case that has been the court case today, right? In preparation. So they throw a big enough tantrum. Hopefully, the people who are ruling will feel bad for the ones who throw the tantrum, like children, and give them what they want. And we see it didn't work. And Daniel Loria is going to explain to us in specific detail what this court case means and why it was so important. There's two court cases today, and I think let's discuss both of them. Daniel, I'll toss the ball.
Shalom, David. It's nice to be here again. It was an amazing day once again. Of course, one has to be a little bit careful because the court cases are unfolding and ongoing. Plus, there's always the opportunity for Arabs to appeal. The appeals that have happened until now, they've actually also lost. There are things that have already gone to the Supreme Court. They have also lost. It seems to be very, very clear of a very basic law, and that is title is title. It doesn't make a difference whether you're living in an Arab country, you're living in a Jewish state, America, England, Australia. You have title that is registered somewhere that has value, that is real. And if you are a squatter in any country in the world, international law, every country in the world has the same concept. You build a house in a green zoned area or a parkland, you're a squatter. You illegally build on someone else's property, you're a squatter. It doesn't make a difference if you've been there for 5 years, 5 minutes, or 50 years. If at some point the owner realizes or the owner is back in town and someone has just built a house on his property, you have rights in any country in the world. And in the case here, we're talking about when Jews were historically driven out from this particular area. We're talking about, as you know yourself, the area called, I think the Arab world called it Silwan. The more recognized name is the old Yemenite village, or Kfar Shiloach, or Kfar HaTemanim, the Yemenite village in the Shiloach, because before there was a single Arab living in this area, today known as an Arab neighborhood called, that's fine, but before there was a single Arab living there, Yemenite Jews came to live in Israel from 1882. It was empty land. The land was owned by Jews, one of whom was called Boaz Habavli, and together with Yisrael Dov Frumkin, they came to the plight of the Yemenite Jews that really came from a distant land, following the Messianic dream, lived in caves in the beginning, struggled a lot, and ultimately an organization, a non-profit organization was established called Ezrat HaNidachim, Help for the Impoverished, or Help for those that came from the distance. And basically, the area was turned into a Yemenite village. It started off with 2 families, then 15 families, and ultimately, at peak, we know of at least 150 families. There could have been more, but for sure, we're talking 150 families. Eventually, Arabs moved in, but unfortunately, as you've spoken about, and I've mentioned on a number of occasions, these pogroms and Arab riots of the 20s and 30s caused enormous damage. They massacred, pillaged, they burnt, and the British, who have got a huge amount to pay for, did absolutely nothing. In fact, they did worse than nothing. They didn't protect the Jews. They take the Jews out of the neighborhood. I actually, from the Yemenite village, I carry on me, as you know, 24 hours a day, even during Corona. When I'm at home, I have in my pocket, 24 hours a day, a letter from the British High Commissioner. It's with me non-stop. The British High Commissioner from the 24th of August 1938, after the British have taken out, forcibly evicted the Jews from their own neighborhood because they didn't want to or couldn't protect them. And the British promise here that the Jewish refugees will be able to return very shortly. It's mind-boggling. This is a British recognition and promise that the Jewish refugees can return to their homes. They recognize it's a Jewish neighborhood. They evicted them forcibly. And maybe they believed, who knows, that the Jews will be able to return in a few months, a year. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. What happened was that the Arabs pillaged, burnt, destroyed the synagogues. There are pictures of destroyed with feces over Torah scrolls, over Bible scrolls, burnt books, holy books from the synagogue. They then pulled apart buildings. There were letters written to and from the British. All this is documented. Pulled apart buildings and ended up squatting in the synagogues and in other Yemenite land. Someone has the audacity and the arrogance in the world to tell Yemenite Jews or Jews who are representing those Yemenites that they have no rights to go back there? Where in the world would that be? So a few years ago, once the synagogue was returned to the Hekdesh, the Sanctified Trust, it was a landmark ruling in the Supreme Court after many, many years that they simply ruled that it was a synagogue. Yes, it was part of the Sanctified Trust that was over 5,000 square meters. But that meant that there are something like 500 to 600 Arabs. No one knows the exact amount because there's no proper noting or registrations of the Arabs living in that part of town. They do as they want. But somewhere between 500 to 600 Arabs living in 20 to 25 different buildings. And every so often, there are court rulings from the Hekdesh who have gone to court, obviously, against these illegal squatters. And I must add to all our listeners, something that's going to shock you. Anywhere in the world, if you're an illegal squatter, you'll be thrown out. Here, the Sanctified Trust was even prepared to pay money of some type of compensation because these Arabs have been living for many years, but as illegal squatters, acting holier than the Pope, as the saying goes. Something rather unique in this Yemenite village and what's unfolding. And today there was yet another ruling, and as you pointed out, they're getting hot under the collar. And as is usually the case with Arabs who don't get their way, we see a lot of violence to try and force the hand of the authorities. But we're talking about the courts, the Supreme Court, who are not in the pockets of the right. And even they say it's rather straightforward, however painful it may be for the families who have dancing on the blood of the Yemenite Jews all these years by just squatting in old Yemenite property. That's in a nutshell. It's fascinating. And you asked me before about the we spoke about the British, I think, on previous occasions. Have we?
Yeah. And what's interesting is that the British today, House of Commons issues this statement. Because this court, one of the court cases is pending. It was pending today, and so have they ever answered any of your letters? You've written them before when they have these sort of statements. It's almost like an insane, amnesiac view of history, where they had nothing to do with the British, had nothing to do with any of this, and so yet they feel that they can go around and dictate to people, from a quote unquote high moral, ground. Have they ever answered you? I mean,
they have no answers. The British are so ideologically bankrupt. They still believe there's some type of empire, which has obviously crumbled totally. This British Empire that basically they were the conquerors. They've got a certain amount of audacity and arrogance to tell the rightful owners of the Holy Land of Israel, the people, on their high and mighty House of Commons chairs, to talk about occupation, they, the greatest occupiers of the world, who were the empire, like previous empires that have come and conquered and colonialized country after country, have the Arabs to talk about our occupation? First of all, they've obviously got very little knowledge of basic history. It's time that we reminded the British that the Jewish national homeland, Palestine, there was a British mandate, and that they themselves recognized the Jewish right to this homeland. And beyond that, here in the specific case of the Shiloach, there are letters from the British recognizing it's a Jewish home. And today they're talking about, they write, we need to show and demonstrate full solidarity with the poor Arab families. Poor Arab families? They allowed the Arabs to riot. They themselves evictedly take out the Jews from the Jewish neighborhood. And today, 80 years later, they're talking about showing solidarity. The Arabs have been taken out of their homes. Are they for real? These are Jewish homes, Jewish land, Jewish title, Jewish rights, and they recognize them. And today they're, it's mind-boggling. They talk about solidarity. Where was the solidarity by the British when Jews are being killed? Where's the solidarity by the British when there's a massacre of 78 doctors and nurses in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, 100 meters away from the British consulate, 100 meters away from a British and Scottish regiment in the Hajj Amin El Husseini's house, and didn't do anything for 8 hours while doctors and nurses were being massacred? 78. Where was their solidarity? Where was their solidarity when the Arabs pillaged?
This goes back to the whole ethos of the British Empire, and much of the world still is the only Jew that's a good Jew is a Jew that's a weak Jew, and a Jew that needs is the refugee Jew, right? So, like, for the British, they go, oh, listen, you're refugees, that's fine, but the second we reassert our sovereignty, then that's it. We're no longer on the right side anymore, and because we didn't go through them. Maybe I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out the logic here, because.
There is no logic.
No, I understand.
There is no logic. This is pure hypocrisy. Like, you can have 5 million refugees from Syria. You have citizens being gassed. You can have total destruction within the Arab world and regimes who are dictators who are killing their own people, and yet the United Nations wants to have resolutions against a Jewish family on a hilltop in Judea and Samaria. I mean, where is the proportion? Where is the morality? We have an army that drops leaflets before they're about to bomb. Where were the nations of the world? Where was the United Nations when America and England and all these allies were bombing Iraq and Iran, and who knows what they're doing? Dropping leaflets? The IDF? Israel Defense Force?
Once again,
we have to ignore what the world says.
That's for sure. Once again, history for them began in 1930 or whatever. There are no Jews here. In their mind, that's what it is, because there's just sort of in my mind, the British rewrote a lot of history. And I believe we were at fault for part of this too. We sort of went along with this, the modern Zionist movement, early 1900s, and because they were working with the British, history begins then. But we all know there was a majority of Jews. We always say it almost every time we talk together. Jerusalem had a majority of Jews up until the British came. No one's saying the Turks were our friends. No one's saying the Turks are easy to work with, but facts are facts. The British came, and we lost our majority in Jerusalem. We became weak Jews.
Yeah, I mean they divided up the old city also.
That's right.
They divided up the city. They changed everything, and it's as though that whatever was beforehand is irrelevant.
That's right.
This House of Commons absurdity is in the same line. For them to make the accusations they're doing, and as though that the poor Arabs justifying illegal squatters when the title is very clear. It's just it's mind-boggling. But we have Yemenite Jews that have returned there.
That's right.
Sorry.
That's right. You're right.
Go on.
History began for
I'm saying the Yemenite Jews have returned to Shiloach. The Jews have returned to the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. It's interesting in some way. It's slightly funny. Hajj Amin El Husseini, in their letter, they talk about Sheikh Jarrah and the British consulate, which is adjacent to the Hajj Amin El Husseini's place. Now, the British, they took over Hajj Amin El Husseini's house. They took it over. Why did they take it over? Because he was responsible for some pogroms, the riots. They expropriated his land, and the British and the Scottish regiments were there next door. And later, the British consulate was in Sheikh Jarrah, in the same Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. And today, so it's okay for them, colonialize, to take over. And yet when the Jews move back, but how ironic it is today that it's the same building that was owned by the Nazi Hajj Amin El Husseini, who was wanted by the Yugoslavians also because he wired a Yugoslavian Jewry with the SS Hanjar that we spoke about on a previous occasion. That same building in the middle of Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood, there's going to be 25, 30, or maybe even 70 Jewish families living. So they can talk, this group, what they call themselves, some all-party parliamentary group of Britain-Palestine, what do they call themselves? Britain-Palestine all-party parliamentary group. They can talk, they can write letters, it means nothing, and they're just like every single conqueror and occupier and hypocrite who shows arrogance and doesn't act with integrity and honesty become bylines in history books. And so too, this parliamentary group. Hopefully maybe some messages that we're saying here will get through to someone in England, who knows, and pass on the message to this parliamentary group and to the House of Commons to act with a certain amount of integrity and decency. Seriously, it's just phenomenal.
So we have these rulings that have been happening in terms of Arabs that are squatters having to now leave. What's the timeline in terms of evicting these? I know there's no specifics, but what's the timeline? What, a year, 2 years, 3 years? Because in reality, you're talking about 600 people. That's a huge chunk of what the world calls Silwan would be all of a sudden would be Jewish. And meaning, I look at it as a skyline. I'm looking out from Ir David, the promenade from Ir David. It'll drastically change what we're viewing at, or how we're seeing it. What's the time?
Well, 5,000 square meters is a large property. We're talking massive. 20, 25 buildings. It's very large. It's a very large, massive property. At the moment, there are 23 families living in 6 buildings, Jewish families living in 6 buildings, and the synagogue, as we know, is back in Jewish hands, undergoing a restoration project. In fact, there's a very large and a wonderful Australian donor who was just given a very special donation to help restore in a big way the synagogue and the cultural centre, which will go a long way. The government is doing its little bit also, although it's being tried to be stopped by Ir Amim, some left-wing radical group that's trying to stop government funding, restore a heritage site. The timeline is difficult to know exactly because the Arabs always have the ability to appeal and to appeal again and to appeal the eviction. It also depends on the court-appointed officers, how they can make it happen. Obviously, it has to be done with a certain amount of the integrity, a certain amount of being careful also. We are talking about still families who are living there, and it's done with as much thought as possible. But at the end of the day, and there are dates given for all these things. It can be 3 months arm ruling, it can be 6 months, it can be 8 months. But then even that be pushed off, as we've seen in the past. Even the synagogue was in court for 7 years before ultimately some of the families who refused to leave, refused to take money, and were forcibly taken out because they were living in an old synagogue. I wonder what the British would say, or what the left-wing extreme radical groups would say, like Ir Amim and Peace Now, if I was living in a 80 or 130-year-old mosque. Would they protect me and my family who'd been for all these years? Or would they scream, Gewalt, no, this belongs to the Arabs, it's a mosque, it's a holy site, has to be returned, you're an illegal squatter? What would they say? We had Arab families living in a synagogue, for heaven's sake. And the courts ruled correctly. The Supreme Court ruled that it was part of the trust and it should be returned, and it has been returned. And the same thing will happen with other places. In fact, some of the Arabs have already made approaches. And unfortunately, if the British House of Commons had any common sense, if they really had some common sense, they would start screaming out about the unethical edicts and fatwas against Arab selling I mean, most 95% of all the work done is because an Arab wants to sell, but he's got this threat hanging over his head that he's killed if he sells to an Arab. He sells to a Jew, sorry. If an Arab sells to a Jew, he's killed. There's an edict. It's a fatwa. Why aren't the British House of Commons jump up and down for that? What a disgrace. Imagine in England if you sold to a Hispanic or a black person, or an American sold to someone from who knows who, to a Latin person, you'd be killed. I mean, it wouldn't last 24 hours. That's an edict. It's a Muslim edict. Where's the House of Commons? Shame, oh shame on the House of Commons.
Okay. When's the next court case coming down the pipe?
I'm not familiar with the actual dates. It's happening all the time because there's quite a few families, there's quite a few buildings. And so far, all the court rulings have been in favor of the sanctified trust. At some point, it'll come to fruition. Obviously can't discuss here if anyone is approaching regarding compensation. There are things that are very sensitive to look after all Arabs involved in any deal, in any case, whether it be Ateret Kohanim or whether it be the Sanctified Trust. One has to tread very carefully. And in fact, even the things that I'm saying, I'm thinking twice and three times before it can be said on the airways. But today was another good day with some good news. At the same time, it was a shame to see such audacity and arrogance and disgraceful twisting of the reality, twisting of history in the letter from this House of Commons. British are gone. We're here. I'm in the state of Israel, and I walk around the Yemenite village.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm going to make a last point here. Interesting, you were saying that titles mean something, and I think this is the difference between Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. The sovereignty, people always ask myself, probably yourself, what's so important about sovereignty? We're still building houses in Judea and Samaria, and we see that Jerusalem has to follow Israeli law. And a sovereign country, there's land laws, there's titles. In Judea and Samaria, a title doesn't necessarily mean anything, as we understand. People can squat on land in Judea and Samaria, and it becomes theirs. And this right there, these cases in Jerusalem prove the need for sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. The very fact that the Israeli government abides by a certain code of law and ethics. We might disagree sometimes on how it's played out, but at least there's a structured set of laws on land rights. When it comes to Judea and Samaria, outside of Jerusalem, there's Turkish, there's British, there's some quasi-Israeli law, and people get away with squatting on, and mostly Arabs, squatting on state land and other people's lands, and then they get the land turned over to them. So just to keep that in mind, listeners or viewers should keep in mind that the case for sovereignty, Jerusalem, and these court cases that Terry Kohanim wins, makes a great case for sovereignty in Judea and Samaria.
The sanctified trust. In this case, it's the sanctified trust, which has gone after the Arabs in that area, not a territory specifically.
That's right.
And yes, I agree with you that, listen, the day has come. It's taken way too long since 1967, leaving Judea and Samaria as a question mark area by the Israeli government has been one of the biggest tragedies of all times.
Right.
You see, in Jerusalem, a decision was made. It's been brought under. It hasn't been fair, not for the Jews, in fact, also not for the Arabs, by leaving it this question mark area under a problematic system of law and under the civil administration. I hope we're getting to the stage now where it can be annexed, do what is necessary. There can never be a Palestinian state here, but maybe we'll leave that for another time.
Definitely. All right, Daniel, very good. We'll keep it coming. We'll talk next week. Shalom.
Shalom. Bye.